They didn't need refrigeration. They didn't need to participate in the massive supply chain that had become the heart of agricultural capitalism. The erasure of sprout culture wasn't a conspiracy in any formal sense, but it was systemic. It was the natural result of economic forces pushing towards centralization, standardization, and consumer dependency. The communities that maintained sprouting traditions were often communities without significant economic or political power. Their food knowledge was devalued as their communities were marginalized. The alternative foods they promoted were associated with poverty, ethnicity, and non-modernity. Meanwhile, the industrial food system presented itself as progress, as science, as the inevitable future. Now, as the environmental and nutritional costs of industrial agriculture become undeniable, there's growing recognition that what was dismissed as old-fashioned might actually have been wisdom. The speed of sprouting, the efficiency, the sustainability, the ability to produce nutritious food anywhere at any time with minimal resources. These aren't just benefits. They're solutions to some of the most pressing food security challenges of the 21st century. What makes this realization bittersweet is the recognition that we abandoned something genuinely valuable, and in doing so, we created generations of people who don't know how to feed themselves without engaging with industrial supply chains. We created dependency when independence was possible. We created artificial scarcity when abundance was achievable. And we did it so effectively that even now, with sprouts re-emerging in health food stores and trendy restaurants, most Americans don't understand that their grandmothers and great-grandmothers knew these secrets. The food history that matters most is often the food history that was never written down, never preserved in official records, never credited to the people who maintained it. The story of sprouts in American food history isn't ultimately about a single plant or even about food production in the narrow sense. It's about how knowledge gets lost, how traditions get erased, and how the systems we build to serve us can end up controlling us instead. Today, as climate change accelerates, as environmental degradation becomes more severe, as questions about food security intensify, sprouts are returning not as a quaint reminder of the past, but as a practical answer to contemporary challenges. Urban farmers grow them in vertical farms. Scientists study them in laboratories. Entrepreneurs develop new technologies to produce them at scale. And scattered throughout immigrant communities, families continue growing them in the ways their ancestors taught them, quietly maintaining traditions that mainstream culture never fully recognized or valued. The plant that can be ready in 48 hours represents something more than nutrition. It represents resilience. It represents the possibility of independence. It represents solutions that don't require massive infrastructure, external inputs, or participation in global supply chains. Most importantly, it represents the recognition that what was lost matters and what was forgotten was valuable. As America and the world grapple with how to feed growing populations sustainably, the answers aren't always in cutting-edge technology or revolutionary new approaches. Sometimes the answers are in the foods and the knowledge systems that were abandoned, devalued, and nearly erased. The plant that grew in plantation gardens and in immigrant kitchen windows is growing again, not as a novelty or a trend, but as a necessity. And perhaps that return signals something larger, a collective recognition that progress isn't always a linear march away from the past, but sometimes a return to the wisdom we should never have abandoned. The story of American food history that gets written in the future will include the chapter about what was lost and then found again. And it will serve as a reminder that the most revolutionary food systems might be the ones that simply honor and revive what our ancestors already knew. There is a tree that once fed millions of Americans. It stood in forests from Maine to Georgia, its branches heavy with sweet, roasted treasures that poor families depended on and wealthy merchants traded across the country. Native Americans taught settlers how to harvest it. Enslaved people on plantations risked punishment to gather its nuts in the woods. Children collected them by the basket as an autumn ritual. Grandmothers perfected recipes passed down through generations. And then, within just a few decades in the early 20th century, it was gone. Almost completely. Today, many Americans have never even heard of it. The tree that once flavored an entire nation, that connected people across race and class, simply vanished. What was it? Why did America forget it? And why is its disappearance still shaping what we eat, who we are, and what we have lost? Before the railroad came to dominate America's economy, and before industrial agriculture reshaped the nation's food supply, there existed a natural abundance that shaped the daily lives of millions of people across the eastern United States. This was the age of the American chestnut tree, a massive giant that grew in the forests of North America with such frequency and size that early European explorers could hardly believe their eyes. These trees were not small or modest. They rose up to 100 feet tall, their trunks so wide that multiple people holding hands could barely reach around them. The canopy created by millions of these trees was so thick that travelers passing through the chestnut forests reported that the sunlight barely reached the ground during midday hours. The trees were everywhere from the mid-Atlantic states down through the southern Appalachian Mountains, covering an estimated 200 million acres of forest land. For centuries, these trees had been the backbone of survival and prosperity for the people living within these forests, whether they were Native Americans who had inhabited the land for thousands of years, European colonists and settlers who arrived starting in the 1600s, or the enslaved African people who were forced to work on plantations carved out of these very forests. The chestnut nuts themselves were remarkable. Unlike many other tree nuts that came later, like walnuts or hickory nuts, chestnuts had a sweet flavor that made them desirable both as a food to eat fresh and as an ingredient in dozens of different recipes and preparations. The nuts were smaller than walnuts, but larger than many other wild nuts, perfectly sized for roasting over fires or for boiling in pots of water to soften them for eating. The meat inside the shell was white and slightly sweet, nothing like the bitter flavor of other native nuts. When roasted in hot ashes or over flames, the skin would crack open, and the nut inside would turn soft and almost buttery, something that could be eaten warm right from the fire. This simple pleasure of roasted chestnuts was something that people remembered their entire lives, something that connected them to their childhoods and to their families. Every autumn, when the spiky green shells fell from the branches starting in late September and running through October, the entire forest floor would be covered with nuts. It was not a situation where people had to search hard or dig around to find enough food. The chestnuts simply fell from the trees in such abundance that families could gather enormous quantities in just a few hours of work. The chestnut was not just food for wild animals or poor people trying to survive. It became a commercial product that was traded widely. Merchants in major cities like Philadelphia, New York, and Boston would send buyers into the rural areas and forests to purchase chestnuts from farmers and gatherers. These nuts would be packed into barrels and wagons, shipped to urban markets, and sold to customers who were willing to pay good money for them. In the late 1800s, chestnuts were being shipped by the millions of pounds to cities, where they were sold to restaurants, bakeries, and families who wanted to eat them as a luxury food. They were used in fancy dishes prepared for wealthy people at dinner parties. They were roasted and sold on street corners by vendors who had small carts with charcoal fires. And poor people could buy a handful of roasted chestnuts for just a few pennies. Chestnuts were ground into flour that was used for baking. They were preserved and stored for the winter months. They were candied and turned into sweets. They were used in stuffings and sauces. The chestnut tree was not just a food source. It was an economic engine that supported hundreds of thousands of people who depended on gathering, processing, selling, or buying chestnuts for their living. What made the chestnut tree even more valuable was the wood itself. The timber was straight, strong, and resistant to rot, which made it perfect for building everything from railroad ties that held the tracks to the ground, to the frames of houses, to the posts and poles used in agriculture. A single large chestnut tree could provide both food in the form of abundant nuts and valuable timber that could be sold to lumber companies. Families in rural areas could supplement their farming income by gathering chestnuts in the autumn and selling chestnut timber in other seasons. The tree gave and gave to the people who lived among them, asking nothing in return except that they be allowed to grow and produce their nuts year after year, generation after generation. On the plantations of the American South where slavery was practiced, the chestnut tree held a particular importance that went beyond its role as a food source or commercial product. Enslaved people who worked from dawn until dark in the fields and mills could escape into the forests where chestnut trees grew, finding temporary refuge and relief from their oppression. During the autumn harvest season, when chestnuts fell from the trees, enslaved workers were sometimes permitted to gather them in their limited free time, and this represented one of the few economic opportunities they had to earn money or barter for goods that they needed. The nuts could be eaten to supplement the meager rations they were given. They could be traded with other enslaved people or with poor white farmers. In this way, the chestnut tree represented a small measure of freedom and autonomy in a system designed to remove every shred of those things. The tree gave something valuable that the enslaved person could possess and control, if only briefly and in secret. For many people living under slavery, the chestnut forests were sacred spaces of memory and survival. The taste of a roasted chestnut might have reminded them of their childhoods, or of family members they had been separated from, or of moments of joy that stood out against the darkness of their daily existence. For poor white farmers and rural families in Appalachia and across the South, chestnuts were equally vital. Many of these families lived on marginal land that was not suitable for large-scale agriculture, and they survived by hunting animals, growing small gardens, and gathering wild foods from the forests. The chestnut was one of the most important of these wild foods. In years when crops failed or when harsh winters threatened starvation, families could survive on chestnuts they had gathered and stored. Pigs were fattened on chestnuts that fell to the ground. Families could boil chestnuts to make a simple starch that could fill hungry bellies. As autumn approached, the gathering of chestnuts was a community event that brought families together. Children helped collect the fallen nuts. Older people sorted them and prepared them for storage or sale. The work was hard, but it was also a time of hope and preparation for winter, a time when people knew that if they had chestnuts, they would have something to eat when the snow came, and the stores at the general store were expensive and hard to reach. The chestnut also shaped the culture and traditions of the people who lived among these trees. Songs were written about chestnuts. Stories were told about massive chestnut trees that had stood for hundreds of years. Recipes were carefully guarded family secrets, passed from mothers to daughters, from grandmothers to grandchildren. Holiday meals in the autumn and winter were centered around chestnut dishes. The smell of roasting chestnuts became associated with family gatherings, with warmth, with the promise of abundance. In many regions, particularly in the South and in Appalachia, the chestnut harvest was as important to the cultural calendar as Christmas or Thanksgiving. People planned their years around this season. They knew the good gathering spots on neighboring lands and would ask permission to collect there. They knew which trees in their own forests produced the largest nuts. Children learned from a very young age how to recognize the spiky shells, how to crack them open, how to tell a good nut from one that had been damaged by insects or disease. In the year 1891, something arrived in America that would change everything. It came not from the American wilderness, but from across the ocean, imported accidentally on chestnut saplings brought from Japan. This was a fungus, a tiny microscopic organism that caused a blight that spread through the bark of chestnut trees and slowly killed them from the inside out. At first, the blight appeared in New York City, in the area around the Bronx Zoo, where the imported Japanese trees had been planted. Nobody understood what was happening or how serious it would become. The fungus worked quietly and efficiently, moving through the bark and cutting off the flow of water and nutrients that the tree needed to survive. A tree that was infected would look healthy for a while, and then suddenly the leaves would wilt. The branches would die. The bark would develop cankers, which are sores that appear on the bark and never heal. Within a few years of infection, the entire tree would be dead. The fungus was so efficient at killing chestnut trees that it seemed almost designed for the purpose. It killed old trees and young trees. It killed trees in the north and in the south. It did not care whether a tree had been there for 300 years or had just been planted the year before. Once the blight took hold of a tree, that tree was doomed. The spread of the blight followed the natural movement patterns of people and goods across the country. Ships carrying lumber and other wood products transported the spores from New York to other ports. Trains moving along the expanding railroad network carried infected wood across state lines. Nurseries and farmers who had purchased chestnut saplings from the initially infected nurseries in New York unknowingly spread the blight further when they planted these trees and when they sold materials from infected trees. By the 1910, the blight had reached the Appalachian Mountains, where the densest populations of chestnut trees existed. By the 1920, it had moved down into the Carolinas and Georgia. By 1940, nearly every wild American chestnut tree in the country was either dead or dying. The speed of the destruction was almost incomprehensible to people living through it. Families who had gathered chestnuts for their entire lives suddenly found that the trees were vanishing. Merchants who had built their businesses on the chestnut trade found that there were no more nuts to buy. Loggers who had been cutting chestnut timber for railroad ties and building materials found that the trees no longer existed. Within 50 years, an estimated 3 billion trees were gone. The forests that had once seemed so endless and so full of abundance were now emptied of one of their most valuable species. The ecological impact was enormous. The forests were changed fundamentally. As the chestnut trees died and disappeared from the landscape, something else happened that was equally tragic in its own way. Americans began to forget. Young people who had never experienced the abundance of chestnuts, who had never gathered them in the forest or tasted them roasted over a fire, grew up in a world where chestnuts were simply not part of their experience. The recipes that had been passed down through families began to be lost. Grandmothers who had known how to prepare dozens of different chestnut dishes died taking that knowledge with them, because nobody in the younger generation had thought to ask them to write down their recipes or to teach them how to make these dishes. The commercial chestnut trade had been so completely destroyed that within a generation, most Americans had never even seen a fresh chestnut. The only chestnuts available in stores were imported from Europe or Asia, and they were expensive and not widely available. Many American families in the mid and late 20th century simply did not know what a chestnut was. They had heard the word in Christmas songs like chestnuts roasting on an open fire, but they had never actually tasted one, never actually seen one, never actually understood what the song was talking about. The loss of the chestnut was particularly significant for African American families and poor rural communities because the economic opportunities that chestnuts had provided were gone. The gathering and selling of chestnuts had been one of the few ways that people without land, ownership, or capital could earn money and achieve some level of economic independence. When the chestnuts disappeared, that opportunity disappeared as well. The cultural significance was also lost. The taste memory, the gathering traditions, the recipes that had been developed over hundreds of years, all of these things vanished. What had been a source of pride and knowledge in these communities, something that had been passed from generation to generation, simply ceased to exist. There were no efforts made to preserve the chestnut, or to save seeds, or to plant new trees. The American government did not step in to help restore the chestnut. The scientific community, which was developing into a more sophisticated discipline in the early 20th century, did not launch major research efforts to fight the blight or to breed resistant trees. The chestnut was simply abandoned to its fate. It died, and America moved on to other foods and other sources of income. In the late 20th century and into the 21st century, there has been a gradual awakening to what was lost when the American chestnut disappeared. Historians and food scholars have begun researching the history of chestnuts in America, uncovering old recipes and old stories about how important this food was to American life and culture. They have found references in old cookbooks and old letters and old diaries that show how central the chestnut was to family meals and community traditions. They have discovered that the chestnut had been particularly important to enslaved African people and to poor rural communities, and that the loss of the chestnut had represented a loss of cultural heritage and economic opportunity for these groups that had not been fully recognized or mourned. Scientists and plant geneticists have begun working on projects to restore the American chestnut tree, using advanced breeding techniques and genetic research to try to create a tree that is resistant to the blight that killed its predecessor. These efforts have had some success, and there are now thousands of young chestnut trees growing in experimental forests and research programs, representing a possible future where the American chestnut might return to the landscape. Some of these restored trees have begun producing nuts again, and people have been able to taste what their ancestors tasted, to experience the flavor that had disappeared for nearly 100 years. The story of the American chestnut is important because it teaches us about what we lose when we take nature for granted and when we do not work to protect the plants and animals that support our food systems and our cultures. It teaches us about the connection between food and identity, about how what we eat shapes who we are and how we remember our past. It teaches us about the way that agriculture and economics and ecology are all interconnected, and that when we lose a plant or animal, we lose not just the food source, but also the traditions, the knowledge, the memories, and the cultural heritage that are connected to it. The chestnut was not just a food. It was a link to the past. It was a source of hope and abundance. It was a symbol of the forest's generosity. It was something that connected people across lines of race and class and geography. When it disappeared, America lost something precious that many people do not even know we lost. Today, the efforts to restore the chestnut represent more than just a scientific project. They represent an attempt to recover something of the past, to honor the people who depended on this tree, and to restore a small part of what was taken from us by accident and by neglect. The story of the chestnut reminds us that we have a responsibility to remember where our food comes from, to protect the sources of that food, and to pass down the knowledge and traditions connected to our foods to the generations that come after us, so that they will know not just what we ate, but why it mattered, and why it is worth remembering.